That's my mom's recipe. The words cut through the hushed elegance of the dining room. A 10-year-old boy, finger pointed at a $70 plate, had just accused the billionaire restaurateur behind him of theft. He was certain. This dish, the celebrated signature that built an empire, was the exact same one his mother made for him every Sunday before she died. The secret she swore to protect. And in that moment, the story everyone believed about genius and innovation began to unravel. The boy was Marcus. The dish was oxtail ossobuco. And the billionaire, Chef Elijah Thorne, had built a $200 million empire on it. But the real story isn't about a stolen recipe. It's about a buried friendship, a broken promise, and the night 20 years ago when Marcus's mother, a line cook named Anya, gave Elijah the one thing that could save his failing restaurant and then vanished. To understand the recipe, you first have to understand Anya. Anya Williams was not a chef, not in the formal white Santok sense. She was a line cook, a prep artist, a woman whose world existed within the steam and sizzle of other people's kitchens. By day, she worked the breakfast shift at a mid-tier hotel. By night, she took whatever gig she could find, catering weddings, staffing private dinners, filling in at restaurants where the turnover was high and the questions were few. She was a ghost in the culinary machine, indispensable and invisible. But at home, in her tiny apartment with the persistent smell of fried onions and hope, she was an artist. The recipe in question was her grandmother. Not written down, not ever. It was learned through touch and smell and silence over a childhood spent perched on a stool in a warm kitchen in Kingston. It was a dish of memory, of poverty transformed into profound richness through patience. Oxtail cheap then, simmered for hours with allspice berries and Scotch bonnet, the meat falling from the bone into a gravy so deep and complex it tasted like history. Her grandmother called it Sunday grace. Anya simply called it home. She arrived in New York in 2001 with 2 suitcases and a diploma from a culinary vocational school that nobody in the city recognized. Her dream was a corner food truck, a place of her own. The reality was a series of kitchen doors that opened just enough to let her in to work and closed firmly on any path upward. She met Elijah Thorne in 2003 at a pop-up dinner in a borrowed Brooklyn loft. He was a sous chef, blazing with ambition and talking loudly about elevating comfort food. She was working the station next to him, quietly turning out perfect vegetable terrines that he, in a frantic moment, accidentally used as his own. He didn't apologize. Instead, he sought her out after the shift, bought her a cheap beer, and talked for 2 hours about his vision. He saw something in her precision, her quiet confidence with food. A friendship of a sort was born. It was built on a fundamental imbalance. Elijah had connections, a growing reputation, and a boundless talent for self-promotion. Anya had silence, sublime skill, and a dream deferred. 5 years their paths wove in and out of the same kitchens. Elijah's star rose. He got write-ups in blogs, then magazines. He leveraged a minor culinary award into backing for his own place. Thorne, a sleek 70-seat restaurant in the West Village, opened in 2008 with a blaze of publicity. The menu was described as brave, idiosyncratic, a reinvention of hearty classics. The reviews were mixed. The food was interesting, critics said, but it lacked soul. It lacked a heart. Within 18 months, Thorne was bleeding money. Reservations dwindled. The investors grew cold. Elijah was facing the unthinkable, a very public, very expensive failure. Anya, meanwhile, had finally saved enough for a deposit on a food truck. She had the permits. She had the design. She had the menu built around a single perfect item, her grandmother's oxtail. She called it Anya's pot. She told only a few people. One of them was Elijah, who she still considered, against all evidence, a friend. The night it happened was in late October 2009, a Tuesday. Rain slicked the streets. Elijah called Anya, his voice stripped of its usual bravado, raw with panic. He asked her to come to the restaurant. He needed her opinion on a new dish, a last-ditch effort to save the place. She went, carrying a container of the oxtail she'd made for her and Marcus's dinner. The kitchen was empty except for him. The dining room was dark. The air smelled of bleach and despair. Elijah looked shattered. He talked about losing everything, about being a joke. Then he saw the container. He asked what it was. Almost as an afterthought, she offered him a taste. What happened next has two versions. The one Elijah would later tell. He tasted it, was inspired, and through a night of collaborative genius, they workshopped the dish together, transforming a home stew into a fine dining masterpiece. He would say Anya was a willing partner in this creation, that the final oxtail ossobuco was as much his as hers. But Anya's version, whispered to her son years later, was different. She said Elijah ate the food. He went very, very quiet. Then he asked for the recipe. She, trusting her friend, wrote it down for him on a grease-stained ticket pad, the ingredients, the steps, the secret of the allspice berries toasted whole. She told him its story about her grandmother, about Sunday grace. She said he listened intently, thanked her, and promised he would only use it as inspiration. He walked her to the door, hugged her, and told her not to worry about her truck, that bigger things were coming for her. 2 weeks later, Elijah Thorne unveiled his revolutionary new signature dish, oxtail ossobuco. The press release called it a 2-year labor of love, a deconstruction and reinvention of a Caribbean classic. Food critics descended. They raved. They called it a revelation, a dish with a story and a soul. One wrote that Thorne has finally found his voice. Reservations flooded in. The investors returned. The dish was photographed, featured, celebrated. It wasn't just a meal. It was the foundation of a myth. And Anya, she called Elijah. He didn't answer. She went to the restaurant. He was unavailable. The message, when it finally came through a junior manager, was clear. She had no proof. It was his recipe, developed in his kitchen. She was a line cook with a grudge. She should be careful about making accusations she couldn't afford to fight. The shock turned to a cold, hardening understanding. Her dream wasn't just deferred anymore. It was erased. The recipe that was to be her future was now the engine of his. The permit for her food truck lapsed. The deposit was lost. She retreated into a silence so deep it worried her young son. She never worked in a professional kitchen again. She took a job as a school cafeteria worker, the irony a private, painful joke. She cooked the oxtail only at home, for Marcus, passing the story to him not as a lesson in bitterness, but as a lesson in knowing where you come from. She died suddenly in 2019, a swift, brutal cancer. She left Marcus with little, some photos, her old knives, and the oral history of a recipe that was feeding a billionaire. For Marcus, the grief was a country he lived in. He was raised by a kind aunt, but he carried his mother's silence and her story. He knew the recipe by heart, by smell, by taste. He could make it in his sleep. The idea of ever eating it in a restaurant never occurred to him, until his aunt, for his 10th birthday, saved for months to take him to the most celebrated place she could think of, Thorne. The moment the plate was set down, he knew. The scent of allspice and slow-cooked beef was as familiar as his mother's embrace. The presentation was fancy, but the soul of the dish was unchanged. It was hers. And in that lavish dining room, surrounded by the evidence of its theft, the quiet boy found a voice he didn't know he had. But here, what Marcus didn't know, what nobody in that restaurant knew. Elijah Thorne heard the accusation, and instead of having the boy thrown out, he froze. The color drained from his face. He ordered the entire kitchen to stop, and he asked to speak to the child alone. Because Elijah Thorne had a secret of his own. A document, locked in a safe, dated the night Anya vanished from his life, and it changed everything about who really stole what. The document was not a recipe, it was a contract. Elijah Thorne led Marcus past the stunned maitre d', through the gleaming stainless steel kitchen where every cook had stopped to stare, and into a private office lined with awards and vintage cookbooks. The room smelled of leather and expensive whiskey. Elijah didn't sit behind the massive desk. Instead, he sank into a chair opposite Marcus, looking not like a billionaire, but like a man waiting for a verdict. "Your mother's name was Anya Williams," Elijah said, his voice low. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. She was my friend, Elijah continued. And you are right, the dish is hers. The admission, so plain and quiet, momentarily stole the anger from Marcus's lungs. He'd expected denial, threats, lawyers. Not this. Then you stole it, Marcus said, the words finding their force again. Elijah shook his head slowly. He reached into a drawer, not the safe Marcus had imagined, but a simple filing cabinet. He pulled out a faded blue folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, with handwritten notes in the margins. The header read, Collaboration and Royalty Agreement. I didn't steal it, Marcus, I bought it. The agreement, dated October 27, 2009, outlined the terms. In exchange for the recipe and its associated narrative heritage, Anya Williams would receive a 15% royalty on all gross sales of the dish, dubbed oxtail osso buco, at Restaurant Thorn. The term was perpetual. It included a clause for any future canned, frozen, or licensed product based on the recipe. It was signed by Elijah Thorn. And beside the line for Anya Williams, there was a bold, clear signature. She signed it, Elijah said, sliding the paper across the desk. That night, she was happy. We celebrated with a cheap bottle of champagne. She talked about finally getting her truck. This, he tapped the royalty clause, was going to be her safety net, her seed money. Marcus stared at the signature. It was her looping, energetic script. Undeniable, the world tilted. Everything his mother had told him, the betrayal, the theft, the silencing, seemed to crumble under the weight of this single page. Had she lied? Had she been ashamed of selling her family's legacy? He looked up, confused, vulnerable. She never got any money. We were poor. A profound sadness settled on Elijah's face. I know, because she never cashed a single check. He opened another folder. It contained a stack of bank statements, each one highlighted. For over a decade, every month, an automated payment had been issued from Thorn Holdings to an account listed under A. Williams Royalty Trust. The amount started small, a few $100s. As the dish became famous, they grew. In the last year, the monthly payments were over $40,000. Every single one had been deposited and then left untouched. The balance in the trust account now stood at just over $3.2 million. I called her when the first payment bounced back, Elijah said, his gaze distant. The phone was disconnected. I went to her old apartment. She was gone, no forwarding address. I hired a PI. He found nothing. It was like she vanished the day after we signed this. He looked at Marcus. I thought maybe she'd had second thoughts, that she hated the dish, hated what I'd done with it, that she'd taken the money and wanted nothing more to do with me. I kept sending the payments to the trust, hoping one day she'd come back for it. For you. This was the story Elijah had told himself for 12 years. The brilliant, fragile friend who gifted him salvation and then disappeared, leaving him with a fortune he felt both proud and guilty to possess. The narrative he'd built his empire upon wasn't a total lie. It was a half-truth with the most important chapter missing. He was the brilliant innovator, yes, but innovating from a foundation he had legally purchased from a ghost. But Marcus's mind was racing, piecing together a different timeline. His mother never acted like someone sitting on a fortune. She budgeted for groceries. She fretted over his school trips. The year this contract was signed, they'd lived in a basement apartment with a leaking pipe. If she had this money, even just the early payments, their life would have been different. She would have bought the food truck. She would have smiled more. She didn't know, Marcus whispered, the realization dawning with cold clarity. She never knew about the account. The door to the office opened. A woman in a sharp suit, Elijah's publicist, leaned in, her face pale. Elijah, it's online. Someone filmed the incident. It's starting to trend. The private confession was over. The private truth was about to collide with the public myth. The video was shaky, shot from a smartphone 2 tables away. It captured Marcus's small, clear voice saying, "That's my mom's recipe." It captured the stunned silence, the look on Elijah's face. It did not capture the meeting in the office. By midnight, it had 1 million views. The headline was irresistible. Billionaire chef accused of recipe theft by 10-year-old. The court of public opinion convened immediately and found Elijah Thorne guilty. Food blogs dug up the old, mixed reviews of Thorne's early menu. Commentators pointed out the sudden, miraculous turnaround after the oxtail dish debuted. The narrative wrote itself. A desperate chef steals from a vulnerable line cook. Elijah's team scrambled. Statements were drafted calling it a misunderstanding, promising a full investigation into the historical origins of the dish. It was weak. The story had the perfect villain, the perfect victim, and a heartbreaking footnote. The mother had died poor. The $3.2 million in the trust account, when a financial blogger uncovered it through a leaked document, only made it worse. It looked like hush money, a secret fund that proved guilt. But then a voice from the past emerged. Carlos Mendez, the former sous chef at Thorne who had been in the kitchen the night Anya visited. Now the owner of a successful taqueria, he gave an interview to a local news station. He remembered the night clearly. He remembered Anya, quiet and serious. He remembered the container of food, and he remembered the argument. It wasn't a collaboration, Carlos said, his face grave. Elijah tasted her stew and his eyes, they got this look, like a man who sees a life raft. He took her into the office. An hour later she left. She looked upset, not happy. The next day, Elijah presented the recipe to us as his own. He said he'd been workshopping it for months. He never mentioned her name again. Carlos's testimony shattered Elijah's happy agreement story. It suggested coercion. It painted a picture of a powerful man cornering a desperate woman. The contract now looked less like a business deal and more like a predatory document signed under duress. Legal analysts began debating its validity. Could a contract be enforced if one party was misled about its fundamental terms, like, say, the creation of a bank account they never accessed? And then the final twist. A food historian, Dr. Lena Clark, published a thread comparing the published Thorne recipe from his cookbook with known traditional Jamaican oxtail recipes. Her analysis was forensic. The Thorne recipe was identical in its core technique to the classic, but it had two subtle, distinct alterations. A specific, uncommon ratio of pimento berries to Scotch bonnet, and a finishing step involving a burnished orange peel, grated, not zested. These weren't innovations. They were fingerprints. These two specific variations, Dr. Clark wrote, are documented in only one place outside of Chef Thorne's cookbook, the handwritten recipe notebooks of one Ivy Reynolds, held in the Jamaican Culinary Archive. Ivy Reynolds was Anya Williams's grandmother. The proof was no longer just anecdotal. It was academic. The recipe didn't just taste like Anya's. It contained the exact, unique culinary DNA of her grandmother. Elijah Thorne hadn't just bought a recipe. He'd purchased and repackaged a family-specific, documented heritage without attribution. The reinvention was a fraud. The pressure reached a breaking point. Food delivery platforms dropped Thorne's meal kits. A planned television show was put on indefinite hold. Protesters stood outside the restaurant with signs that read, "Give Anya her name back." The empire built on a single dish was cracking under the weight of its origin story. Inside his townhouse, Elijah Thorne faced not just a public relations disaster, but a personal reckoning. The document in his safe had been his shield for 12 years. Now it was the evidence burning his house down. He had a signature, but he didn't have the truth. And the truth, in the form of a confused and angry 10-year-old boy, was demanding payment in a currency far more valuable than money: legacy. Marcus, sitting in his aunt's living room watching the news cycle spiral, held onto one fact tighter than any other. His mother didn't know about the money, which meant, in her mind until the day she died, Elijah Thorne was a thief. That was the story she believed. That was the story she left him. And that was the story he would fight for. He didn't know that Elijah Thorne, starring at the uncashed checks and the raging headlines, had come to a terrifying conclusion. To save what was left of his name, he would have to prove the contract was valid. And to do that, he would have to prove Anya Williams was a liar. he would have to dismantle the memory of a dead woman in front of her son. The legal papers arrived at Marcus's aunt's house 1 week later, a lawsuit filed by Thorne Holdings. It did not sue Marcus. It sued the estate of Anya Williams for breach of contract. The claim that by publicly disparaging the dish and falsely claiming theft, the estate had damaged the brand built around the legally purchased recipe. The demanded remedy was severe: full public retraction and the transfer of all rights to the recipe back to Thorne Holdings in perpetuity, nullifying the royalty agreement forever. It was a brutal, calculated move. Attack the source. Make the story a dry, legal dispute over signatures and dollars. Drag a child into a deposition room. The private war had just gone nuclear, and the only person who could possibly know what really happened in that office 20 years ago was gone. To fight a lawsuit against a ghost, Marcus needed a lawyer. The kind they couldn't afford. Marcus's Aunt Rosa, a tired but fiercely protective nurse, stared at the legal documents like they were written in a foreign language. The words summary judgment and litigation costs swam before her eyes. She called legal aid, but the case was too complex, too niche. She called personal injury firms, but they weren't interested in intellectual property disputes. The clock was ticking. A response had to be filed in 30 days, or the court would rule in Thorne's favor by default, stripping the estate of its rights forever. The pressure was a physical weight in their small apartment. But the story had captured something bigger than a courtroom. A pro bono attorney, Billionaire Vance, reached out after seeing the news coverage. She specialized in arts and heritage law, a field that dealt with the theft of indigenous crafts and folk music. She saw this as the same fight, the appropriation of cultural legacy by a powerful entity. She took the case for free. Her first move was not to file a response to the lawsuit. It was to file a counterclaim. She sued Elijah Thorne, individually and through his companies, for fraud, unjust enrichment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The demanded remedy was staggering. All profits from the dish since its inception, estimated at over $38 million plus punitive damages, and the immediate public attribution of the recipe to Anya Williams and Ivy Reynolds. It was a declaration of total war. The message was clear: you want to fight over a contract, we'll fight over everything you built with it. Billionaire's strategy was forensic. She subpoenaed Thorne's financial records, not just for the royalty account, but for all communications around the dish's development. She hired a forensic document examiner to analyze the original contract, and she began digging into the night of October 27, 2009, with the precision of a detective. Meanwhile, Elijah's legal team, led by a sleek, aggressive firm known for defending tech giants, went on the attack. Their strategy was character assassination. They filed a motion to dismiss the counterclaim, arguing it was a frivolous attempt to exploit public sympathy. Attached to the motion were sworn affidavits. One was from a former roommate of Anya from 2005, who claimed Anya had borrowed money and recipes from others without giving credit. Another was from a chef who worked at the hotel with Anya, who said she was secretive and sometimes dishonest about her work. The implication was insidious. Anya Williams was not a trustworthy source. Maybe she had stolen the recipe from her own grandmother. Maybe she had a history of this. When Marcus saw these affidavits, a quiet fury settled in him. They were attacking a woman who couldn't defend herself. They were painting his mother as a thief and a liar to a million strangers. This was no longer about money or credit. This was about her name. But Billionaire Vance was ready. The forensic document examiner found something curious: the signature page of the contract. Under high-resolution spectral analysis, the examiner found a faint second impression underneath Anya's signature. It was the ghost of another signature, signed on a different piece of paper that had been on top of this one. That other signature, Elijah Thorne. The examiner's theory was damning. Thorne had signed his own name first on a blank sheet. Then he'd placed the contract terms on top of that sheet and had Anya sign, creating a carbonless copy impression of his signature beneath hers. Why? It could suggest the terms were presented to her after he'd already signed, a classic bait-and-switch tactic. Or worse, that her signature was obtained on a different document entirely. Then Alina hit the jackpot. Buried in thousands of pages of Thorne's internal emails, she found one from the morning after the famous night, sent from Elijah's personal account to his then business manager. The subject line, William's situation. The body was brief. Agreement secured. She doesn't get the back-end royalty accounting, just the monthly check. Keep the trust details with the lawyers. Need to move fast on the PR rollout. This is our lifeline. The email was a bomb. She doesn't get the back-end royalty accounting. It confirmed Marcus's instinct. Anya was deliberately kept in the dark about the true value and the structure of the trust. She was given a simple monthly check with no visibility, and the instruction to keep the trust details with the lawyers suggested a conscious effort to obscure. This wasn't a collaboration between friends. It was an acquisition by a businessman who knew exactly how to structure the deal to his maximum advantage and her minimum awareness. Alina released the email to the press. The narrative shifted again, violently. Now Elijah wasn't just a thief, he was a calculating predator. The contract was a sham designed to look legitimate while hiding the true mechanics. Food critics who had championed him wrote scathing op-eds about culinary colonialism. Former colleagues began giving anonymous interviews, describing a pattern of creative borrowing throughout his career. The brand was in freefall. Inside his fortress, Elijah Thorne was unraveling. The email was real. He had no defense for it. His lawyers advised him to settle, to offer Marcus the $3 million and a quiet co-credit, but something in Elijah broke. The boy's face, so like Anya's, haunted him. The mountain of money he'd made felt like ash. He wasn't a predator, he was a pragmatist. He'd saved his restaurant, saved his employees' jobs. He offered her a deal, a good deal. The royalty was generous. She'd vanished. In a moment of raw, uncalculated despair, he did something his publicist would have called professional suicide. He requested a private meeting, not with the lawyers, with Marcus and his aunt. Alina Vance advised strongly against it, but Rosa, after a long night of thought, agreed. She wanted to look the man in the eye. They met in the neutral, sterile conference room of Alina's law firm. Elijah came alone, without his suit armor, dressed in a simple sweater. He looked old. He looked at Marcus and his first words were, "I'm sorry." Then he told a third story, a story he'd never admitted to anyone, not even himself. He confessed that Carlos, the sous chef, was right about the argument. Anya hadn't been happy. When he presented the typed contract, she'd balked. She didn't want a percentage of a dish in a fancy restaurant. She wanted her name on it. She wanted the story told. She wanted the food truck, he pleaded. He told her his restaurant would fail without it, that her version was too ethnic, too niche for fine dining. That he was refining it, elevating it for a broader audience. That the money from the royalty would be more than she'd ever make from a truck. He appealed to their friendship, to her pity. He'd worn her down. "She signed it," Elijah said, his voice hollow. "But she looked at me afterward and she said, 'You're taking my home and putting it in a museum. Don't expect me to visit.' Then she left. The email was me trying to lock the door behind her, to make sure she couldn't change her mind. I was scared she would. I didn't think she wouldn't cash the checks. I thought the money would fix it." He slid a new document across the table. It was a deed of amendment to the original contract. It struck the confidentiality clause. It added Anya Williams's and Ivy Reynolds's names as co-creators on all future menus, cookbooks, and marketing. It increased the royalty to 25%, retroactive to the first sale. And it established the Anya Williams Legacy Fund, funded by a lump sum of $5 million from his personal assets, to provide grants to immigrant women seeking culinary entrepreneurship. "This is what I should have offered her that night," he whispered. "It's what I'm offering you now. You can have the money and the trust. You can have this. You can own the story. Just please, let the dish live. It's the only truly good thing I've ever made." The room was silent. Rosa looked at Alina, who gave a slight, cautious nod. The offer was more than legally sound. It was overwhelmingly favorable. It was surrender. Marcus stared at the document. Then he looked at the man who had caused his mother a lifetime of quiet hurt. He thought of her hands, rough from cafeteria work. He thought of the smell of her stew, the sound of her laugh. He thought of her never visiting the museum of her own home. He didn't take the paper. "It's not yours to give," Marcus said, his voice clear in the quiet room. "And it's not mine to take, it was hers, and you broke it." He stood up. The meeting was over. As he walked to the door, he turned back. "You asked her not to visit, she never did, but I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Elijah Thorne sat alone in the conference room as the door closed. His offer of peace had been refused. The lawsuit would continue. The public evisceration would continue. He had laid his empire on the table as a peace offering, and the boy had left it there, untouched. He had won the legal argument, perhaps, but he had lost the story. And in the court of legacy, the story is the only verdict that lasts. As Marcus and Rosa walked to their car, a black sedan pulled up beside them. The window rolled down. Inside was a woman in her 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes. She introduced herself as Maureen Thorne, Elijah's mother. She asked for 5 minutes, and she handed Marcus a small, sealed cardboard box. "He asked me to destroy this years ago," she said. "I couldn't. I think it belongs to you now." Inside the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was Anya's old recipe notebook, and tucked between its pages was a single, faded photograph. It showed a much younger Elijah and Anya, laughing in a messy kitchen, arms around each other's shoulders. On the back, in Anya's writing, it said, "With the night we saved the restaurant, partners." The picture told a fourth story, one of genuine friendship before the fall, one that changed everything about the 3 stories that came before it, and it raised a terrifying final question. If they were partners that night, what happened in the morning? The notebook didn't contain just recipes. It contained a diary. Tucked between measurements for jerk seasoning and notes on curry gravy were Anya's private thoughts, scribbled in the margins on napkins on the backs of old receipts. The entries were sporadic, emotional. They were the key to the fourth story. Alina Vance, Marcus, and Rosa sat at the kitchen table and read them together under the harsh fluorescent light. The earliest relevant entry was dated a week before the famous night. "Met with today. He looks terrible. Restaurant is sinking. He asked if I had any magic left. He doesn't want magic. He wants a miracle. I told him about Grandma Ivy's oxtail. His eyes lit up. That look scares me sometimes, like he's seeing a dollar sign, not a dish." Then the entry from the night of October 27th. "He did it. He asked for the recipe, not for inspiration, for the restaurant to save it. He had a contract already typed. He talked so fast. Royalties, percentages, a trust. It sounded like a prison made of money. I said no. I said I wanted my name on it. I wanted my story told. He got desperate. He cried. He said he'd lose everything. He said he'd make sure I was taken care of, that this was better than a food truck. He said we were partners. He showed me the picture we took. I felt sick. I signed it. I sold my grandmother's grace for a promise and a percentage of a lie. I am a coward. I took the check. I will cash it tomorrow and start over, far away from him." The next entry was 3 days later. The handwriting was shaky. "Went to bank, tried to deposit check. Bank said account number on check doesn't exist. Called he said it was a clerical error, a problem with the trust setup. Said a new check would come. He sounded strange, distant. I don't think he's sending a new check. I think I signed my family away for nothing. I have been a fool." The final entry on the matter was 2 weeks after that. "No check. No calls returned. Saw the review in the Times today. Thorne's triumphant oxtail ossobuco, a personal journey of rediscovery. My journey, my grandmother's journey. He didn't even change the name I suggested. He just took it. I will never get it back. I will never speak to him again. This ends here. For Marcus, I will pretend it never happened. Some truths are too heavy for a child to carry." The story was now complete. They were partners in spirit that night, bound by friendship and a shared moment of hope captured in a photograph. But by morning, the partnership had been corrupted. The machinery of business, the erroneous account, the silenced phone, the calculated distance, had turned a bond into a betrayal. Elijah may not have intended the technical failure of the trust, but his subsequent silence and his rush to claim sole credit were a choice. A choice that cost a friendship and buried a legacy. Eleanor Vance had everything she needed. The diary entries, combined with the account doesn't exist bank statement she swiftly subpoenaed, proved fraud in the inducement. Anya had signed based on a promise of immediate financial support, a promise that was technically broken before the ink was dry. The contract was not just predatory, it was fundamentally breached from its first moment. She presented this evidence to Elijah's lawyers with a simple ultimatum: withdraw the lawsuit against the estate with prejudice, sign the amended contract granting full credit and the legacy fund, and transfer the $3.2 million to Marcus's guardianship. Or face a trial where she would read Anya's diary aloud in open court and enter the photograph into evidence, telling the story of a partnership betrayed. Elijah Thorne, through his lawyers, agreed to every term. There was no fight left. The empire was hollow. The reviews were toxic. The restaurant Thorne closed permanently 6 weeks later. The brand was unsalvageable. The settlement was executed in a judge's chamber, a quiet, administrative end to a deafening public drama. Marcus, through a trust, became the owner of the recipe's copyright and the beneficiary of its past profits. The Anya's Pot food truck, operated by a nonprofit in her name, launched its first pilot in Queens, serving affordable, transformative oxtail to the neighborhood she loved. The Legacy Fund received its $5 million. And Elijah Thorne, he sold his remaining assets, paid his debts, and left the city. He moved to a small town in the Hudson Valley. The gossip column said he was broken. The food world forgot him. But that is not where the story ends. 1 year after the settlement, on a bright fall day, Marcus and his Aunt Rosa took the train upstate. They carried a simple container. They arrived at a modest cottage with a large, unruly garden. Elijah answered the door, older, softer, wearing gardening gloves. He was stunned, then wary, then quietly invited them in. They sat in his kitchen, a real home kitchen, not a professional one. Marcus placed the container on the table. "I made this," Marcus said. "It's the recipe, my version." Elijah slowly opened it. The smell of allspice and slow-cooked beef filled the room. The smell of his former life, of his greatest sin, and his only genuine creation. His eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough. "Because you loved it too," Marcus said simply. "And my mom wouldn't want it to die with you. She wrote that you were the only other person who ever understood what it was supposed to be." Elijah looked at the boy, now 11, who carried his mother's quiet wisdom and his grandmother's unbreakable legacy. He saw no hatred, no triumph, just a solemn, profound offering. He took a fork and tasted it. He closed his eyes. "You used a darker rum at the finish." "Yes," Marcus said. "It's better." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Elijah spoke, staring at the food. "I loved your mother, not romantically, as the best part of myself I ever knew, and I was so afraid of failing that I broke that part to save the rest. I have been trying to apologize to a ghost for a year. I don't know how." "You just did," Rosa said softly. Marcus slid a final document across the table. It was a one-page agreement. It granted Elijah Thorne a limited, non-exclusive license to cook the recipe, for personal use only, not for sale, not for publication. It required one line of attribution, based on the recipe of Anya Williams and Ivy Reynolds. It was a gift, permission to remember but not to profit, permission to carry the taste of his friendship without the weight of his theft. Elijah Thorne signed it with a hand that did not shake. As they left, Marcus turned at the door. "The food truck is doing really well. We're opening a second one." Elijah nodded, a real, uncomplicated smile touching his face for the first time. She'd have loved that. "I know," Marcus said. The truth was, nobody stole the recipe. Not in the end. A woman shared it. A man broke it. A child mended it. It was never about ownership. It was about stewardship. Anya Williams was its first steward. Elijah Thorne failed in his stewardship. And Marcus, by choosing to share it again with the world through a food truck and even with the man who failed it, became its final and most profound keeper. The dish outlived the restaurant. The legacy outlasted the scandal. And the story, the full, messy, human story, became the only thing that mattered. It was a story about how we honor what we are given, how we fail those who trust us, and how sometimes the only way to fix a broken thing is to pass it carefully to the next pair of hands. So what was really stolen that night? It wasn't just a list of ingredients. You can't copyright a memory. You can't trademark a taste of home. What was taken and what was later restored was far more fragile and powerful, a story's rightful owner. For years, the story of that oxtail belonged to Elijah Thorne, a tale of solitary genius. But its true story of immigration, of a grandmother's hands, of a mother's quiet love, that belonged to Anya and Marcus. The real crime was the silencing of that narrative. The real justice was its return. This story forces us to ask a difficult question. In a world that values brands over belonging and intellectual property over inherited wisdom, how do we protect the things that can't be patented? A family recipe, a folk song, a craft technique passed through generations. These are the threads of our cultural fabric, and they are vulnerable to those who see not their soul, but their market potential. Marcus's journey shows us that the defense isn't always a lawsuit. Sometimes it's a deeper, more radical act, stewardship. He didn't just reclaim the recipe, he transformed its purpose. From a luxury item on a billionaire's menu, he helped turn it into community nourishment from a food truck. He converted its disputed profits into grants for others with similar dreams. And in a final act of breathtaking grace, he even returned a piece of it to the man who broke it, not as a reward, but as a reminder of what was lost. Legacy is not a vault, it's a conversation. It breathes only when it's shared with respect, when credit flows to its source, and when its benefits are allowed to circle back to the community it came from. Anya's recipe was never meant to be a secret. It was meant to feed people. It was meant to connect a boy to his grandmother. It was meant to be a gift. In the end, the most valuable thing Marcus secured was not the money, or the credit, or the legal victory. It was the right to tell his mother's story in her voice on his terms. He restored her to her proper place in the narrative, not as a victim or a side note, but as the heart of it. We all have recipes, not just for food, but for how we live, how we treat others, what we pass on. What's in your box? What story are you stewarding? And perhaps more importantly, whose story have you been entrusted with? This story reminds us that while contracts can be broken and fortunes can be lost, the legacy of a single act of kindness, or of courage, or of forgiveness is permanent. Marcus could have chosen hatred. He chose understanding. That choice didn't just change his life and Elijah's, it changed the very meaning of the recipe itself. It added a new ingredient: redemption. If this story resonated with you, consider what silent legacies you carry. And if you believe in the power of stories that heal, that challenge, and that restore, then help us share more of them. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We are here to bring you documentaries that don't just tell you what happened, but reveal why it matters to all of us. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever inherited something, a story, a tradition, a secret that changed your understanding of who you are? We would love to hear your story. Thank you for listening. Remember, the most powerful legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's the care with which you handle what was left for you.